Welcome to my presentation, Finding the Formula of Narrative Structure. In this video, I'll be describing a task I've designed to embed numeracy learning opportunities in a Year 10 English class. So without further ado, let's get to it. Some quick contextual points. I chose to design this task for a Year 10 English class because it builds upon prior knowledge they would have learned in previous year levels, and it does so in a kind of complex way. Adding in the numeracy opportunities again makes it a more ambitious task. The topic is narrative structure in text, so if you're familiar with the terms orientation, climax, and resolution, this is essentially what we're talking about in this unit. And finally, I believe that this task, as I've designed it, would take about 2 weeks of lesson time to cover. Before the start of the unit, the teacher would have selected a range of potential text to use within the unit. The aim is to use both a novel and a short story that have reliable film adaptations, but the teacher should avoid outright choosing the text. Instead, they would hold a class vote for the first text, allowing students to vote on the novel that they'll use in the unit, and giving them a few weeks to become familiar with it first by reading the novel and thinking about it more deeply. In Lesson 1, the teacher would make clear the content of the unit, so what topics would be covered and what learning activities the students will engage in. And they'll also review the topics of narrative structure using Freytag's pyramid. Freytag's pyramid is a popular representation of narrative structure that's used often in English classes. However, it's not really reflective of narrative structure for a few reasons, so variations will also be used. As you can see in this comparison, the basic structure of Freytag's pyramid doesn't really work in practice. When the climax is placed in the midway point of a text, there is a lot of nothing left to cover in the rest of the run or read time. It's also important to note that a story doesn't always start and end in the same way, so things might happen that mean there's lingering dramatic action at the end of a narrative, or there might be a cliffhanger to prepare readers and viewers for a sequel. So the orientation and the climate and the resolution would not always be on the same level. And hopefully these are points that students would pick up on, or they could be guided towards in a class discussion. In Lesson 2, we introduced the concept of tension as a way to describe dramatic action. So you'd expect a climax to be a tense experience compared to a conclusion or orientation. Based on their experience of reading the first novel, the teacher and class worked together to create a scale of tension, and for homework, the students watched the film adaptation of the novel. In Lesson 3, students are now ready to make their own representations of narrative structure in the text. Using a scale of tension they've agreed upon in class, they can begin to plot the tension on the y-axis and time on the x-axis to create graphs or Freytag's pyramid of the text they've engaged with so far. And this is an opportunity for collaborative group work and smaller groups of about 3 to 5. This breaks up the dense workload that the students might encounter, and it creates a system of support and offers opportunities for students to discuss their findings with each other. So their aim is to create something like this. And a fun fact for you is that I actually didn't know how to create a graph in Excel. So this was very interesting for me. At the end of Lesson 3, the students vote on the short story and film adaptation that they'll analyze for homework. And then we go to Lesson 4. We continue our graphing in groups, this time making graphs for the short story and film that they reviewed for homework. By the end of this lesson, students are expected to finalize 4 of their Freytag pyramids for the novel, the short story, and the 2 films, and submit them to the teacher. The teacher compiles this data to present in class the next day to show the comparison between the group's interpretations of narrative structure and between the way narrative structure is used in different texts. So here's an example of how the graph for the first film might be, with each of the group's data represented in colors that they can identify and use to compare their experience in viewing with their classmates. Lesson 5 gives students a chance to analyze and discuss the data they've created with their classmates. They're then asked either as a class or in their small groups to use the data to synthesize their findings by creating a formula for narrative action. At the end of this lesson, students are asked to analyze a film of their choice with narrative structure before the next lesson. And during the discussions, they might also use percentages and fractions to create their formula. So using things like phrases like all the main characters should be introduced by 15% of the runtime, or 3/4 of the novel should be spent actually completing the quest with about 15% of the task to introduce the situation, at the start to introduce the situation and 10% at the end to tie up loose ends, so they can engage with more mathematical concepts in these discussions. And then in Lesson 6, they use their analysis of the film and the formula they've created to reverse engineer the adaptation process, translating their film into a short story. Alongside the story, students would be asked to write a rationale for how they applied the formula and the data they've created and interpreted from other texts to condense the film into a short story. So this is just the basic structure of the unit, but there are plenty of ways to simplify it or make it more complex, or add layers to it that could promote critical orientation by perhaps observing the differences in pacing between a Regency period novel and a modern-day rom-com. This task also makes use of a range of teaching strategies. So direct instruction makes the unit seem clear and approachable, collaborative learning promotes that system of support, and free choice motivates students to engage by letting them seek out texts that are relevant to them. I've also designed this task with the Goose model in mind, trying to promote positive dispositions and a critical orientation towards the use of numeracy outside of the mathematics classroom. The students engage with mathematical knowledge and skills they would already be familiar with, meaning that the task is using numeracy in an achievable way that would help instill confidence in the students as numerate individuals. So that's my presentation, and thank you so much for watching. I had a lot of fun designing this task, and I hope that you had some fun learning about it. I might even be able to start engaging with the concepts I've discussed in your own life as a consumer of pop culture. As a reader of books and a viewer of films, I hope this helps you in some way. Thank you so much. Bye.